Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Critical Success Factors for an Enterprise Mobile Strategy. My name is Rihanna Collier and I'm Vice President of the Software Division at SIIA. I know that everyone has busy schedules, so we're delighted that you could join us today for some really great content. Before we get started, I just want to provide a couple of housekeeping reminders. First, all of your phone lines are currently on mute. We will be recording this webinar and we will make the recording available to all of you. This will include the slide presentation as well. We also want to make sure that you leave today's webinar with the information you came looking for. So our speakers will be happy to answer any questions you have. I'm going to ask that you submit your questions in the chat box on the left of your screen. I'll be fielding questions and directing them to our speakers at the end of the presented content. We'll do our best to answer all of your questions. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I do want to highlight SIA's flagship conference for 2013, All About the Cloud, taking place May 7th through 9th in San Francisco. This conference brings together top decision makers from the ISV community, and for the first time we are offering an exclusive early bird rate where you can save $500 off the registration rate. This rate is only good until January 4th, so if you have leftover budget, this is a good way to use it. Also, for those interested, we will be opening an official call for speakers next week. So I encourage you to go to the website to learn more, or my email address is there on the screen, so feel free to drop me a note if you have any questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. We are delighted to have Anthony Hernandez, Principal with Grant Thornton's Business Advisory Services, IT Strategy and Risk Management, and Mike Barba with Grant Thornton's Business Advisory Services and Information Risk Management. Anthony and Mike, I'll turn it over to you to talk about a successful enterprise mobile strategy.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. Everybody, welcome. We do appreciate you taking the time to participate in our webinar today. I would encourage folks to submit their questions as they have them, and I know we have a lot of content. We'll do our best to either get them answered directly on the webinar or we will send a follow-up, okay? So what we have here today is what was originally about a half a day's worth of content around mobile strategy and risk management that we had to distill down to an hour, and we still have a lot of content, but we think the content is very valuable. Our intention is to have enough information for you to be able to use the deck and to put some thought into how you're going to manage risk and what your strategy is going to be around mobile computing. So with that said, our plan, we're going to talk a little bit about exactly what mobility and mobile computing means. Spend some time on risks, things you should be considering from an implementation perspective, some of the technology solutions around those risks, and then a brief discussion on the deployment roadmap. I think just to be clear, I want to make sure we're on the same page about what this presentation is not. The key area we get questions when we talk about mobile computing is, how do I integrate mobile computing with my enterprise applications? I want to do mobile reporting. I want to provide better insight into, my executives spend a lot of time on the road and they want insight into financials, et cetera. It is not enterprise application integration with mobile computing. It's more about kind of the platforms and the risks associated with the platforms, okay? So with that, we'll jump into kind of the overview of mobile computing. Mobile computing used to be just it was anybody who had a laptop, and then about 10 years ago, it was essentially anybody with a laptop and a BlackBerry, and it has now changed to just about certainly any cell phone, smartphone, tablet, e-reader, as well as your laptops and your BlackBerries. And it has become a preferred method or mode of communication for a great number of people. The other interesting aspect to this is that it's not just about the platform, and I have an iPad or I have an iPhone or I have a BlackBerry. It's also the fact that you are getting access to corporate information via that device. And from that perspective, you have to start thinking about that device as a corporate asset that needs to be managed and protected. Okay. So what's driving enterprise mobility? I think enterprise mobility is one of those technologies that actually in the business world is being driven by consumer adoption to a very large extent. I have a number of clients that have come to us and said, originally we were BlackBerry only, but the executives all have iPhones. We got to find a way to support iPhone. We have to find a way to support Android. They have an iPad that they bought at home. They want to use their iPad to get access to corporate resources. That's a pretty significant shift. In most cases, advancements in technology are seen first in the business, and then they tend to trickle down to the consumer. And this is one of those areas where it's gone the other way. So let's talk, again, I just alluded to kind of the consumerization of mobile technologies. One of the interesting aspects around this is the forecast growth. It took 15 years to go from 100 million PCs to 1 billion PCs. It's going to take probably about half that time. And to go from 100 million mobile devices to 1 billion mobile devices, with the thought being around 20 billion mobile devices by 2020. And you certainly start to see that more and more. I think you not only have just about every adult has their own device, but you start seeing it younger and younger. Every child, grandparents, everybody now has a mobile device. And as it goes beyond kind of the industrialized nations to a broader outreach across the globe, it will become even more and more pervasive. Okay? There's a little bit of a double-edged sword to this. You have greater access to information, faster access to information. You also have, people have greater, faster access to you. It's become, normal for people to kind of check their email on the weekends, where it used to be that culturally, at 5 o'clock on a Friday, you turned off work and you didn't think about it till 8 o'clock on Monday morning. I'm not sure most people are firing up their laptops and reading their emails, but I do believe most people will check their BlackBerry or check their iPhone just to make sure there's no surprises when they get in on Monday. So it's being driven by this increased need to know, increased interaction. Okay. The other seminal change in kind of the mobile computing world has been a shift. 6-7 years ago, BlackBerry dominated this market, and it was driven largely by the amount of control they offered over corporate information. BlackBerry was primarily, contacts, calendar, and email, but the amount of information that is potentially sensitive that most people from a business perspective will receive in a given day made kind of the control and governance over the device very, very important. And early on, BlackBerry did that really better than anybody and was the corporate device of choice. Over about the last 18 months to 2 years, the Android and Apple space have really focused on how to make their products a corporate product and implement some of the controls that are required for a corporate product to essentially manage. And we're going to spend part of the presentation today talking in more detail about just that. How do you manage, both from a policy perspective and a technology perspective, these devices? Okay. Again, this is an interesting slide just in that the amount of both support and plans to support for both the Android and the Apple is growing, and it's growing significantly. It's the fastest growing space. And anecdotally, we know that they have made both Android, the Android marketplace, and Apple have made significant investments in getting a corporate governance, both strategy and technology, to manage their devices. Okay. Last kind of enterprise mobility comment we want to make before we jump into some of the details is kind of the interaction with social media. Social media in itself is an entire presentation around risks and integration with the business. This is another generally consumer technology that has kind of forced itself on the business. Everybody kind of had MySpace and Facebook, and then kind of it's grown into, gosh, you got to have a LinkedIn, and if you're a salesperson, you should have Twitter, etc. So the marriage between mobile computing and social media is really here to stay. And the comment I'll make broadly is there has grown an entire generation that this is the way they interact. Primarily, they interact through their mobile device and through social media, where for some of us older folks, you'd get on the phone or you'd go meet somebody face to face. They're texting, or they're chatting, or they're sending Facebook messages to their friends, and as an organization, if you're not prepared to manage that, there's an entire generation of both employees and customers that you'll be behind the eight ball in how you're interacting with them. So you need to be planning for both your mobile strategy as well as its interaction with social media when you're talking about interacting with that generation. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead to risks, and I will have Mike talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Tony. So as Tony described, smartphones, mobile devices offer great opportunities for you to do new and exciting things as a business. However, with that comes a high number of new and important risks that we have to understand. Mobile devices today aren't simply email devices where you can send brief messages and communicate. They have all the power of a full laptop or desktop or workstation literally sitting in the palm of your hand. There are numbers of things that you can do and accomplish from a productivity standpoint, but it also introduces all the same types of risks that you have on a workstation or corporate-owned machine. So what are some of the specific risks? Really, you have to think about data flows and where does your data reside, within your device and across your networks. So mobile devices, contain traditionally a lot of communication-based information: text, SMS, emails, phone and voicemail messages. However, new devices contain tons of other information resident both locally and within the applications on the device, such as video or photos. So think if you're a doctor and you're taking pictures of patients or x-rays and you're looking at them on your phone. Information that you might post up to a social network that someone might find sensitive. Location information from your GPS. Where are you at a particular point in time? Voice recordings, voice notes, data and documents. You have full data and document readers on your mobile devices, and potentially cache credentials to enterprise networks and applications. Again, as all this data moves out onto the mobile device, we have to think about how we're going to implement controls to protect that information. Further, just like your workstations or PCs in the corporate environment, there's a number of diverse attack vectors resident on those devices. Not only do they have the ability to connect to the cellular networks, your 3Gs and 4Gs of the world, but they're also Wi-Fi enabled devices and Bluetooth enabled devices, so they are prone or susceptible to any attacks against those types of connections. In addition, all of your browser-based attacks, whether it be to Internet Explorer, Firefox, Safari, Chrome, are all something that you have to pay attention to on the phone. Further, we have this idea that users can install any of a number of applications from application stores put forward by either Android or by Apple, and those applications may be susceptible to attack. So lots of different ways that we can attack these devices, and not necessarily a lot of control that most organizations have implemented today. Further, increasing the level of risk with these devices. Most organizations don't have a strong plan in place to patch or update the devices and the software and applications on it to make sure that when vulnerabilities are discovered, they aren't easily exploitable. As you can see in the chart, so it's a little bit of a small chart, but there's a lot of red showing devices simply aren't patched that are out there in the marketplace today. Maybe this is something that you would think is kind of crazy to not patch workstations or desktops in the corporate environment, but are you thinking about doing that on the phone? Even though some of the exact same risks that apply to your desktops and workstations also apply to the phone. So key point here on the next slide, talking about how we're going to manage the risks. There's a number of different risks associated with this. Security, as we talked about, privacy risks, regulatory risks, and a number of different solutions as well. We're going to walk through each one of the solutions a little bit later on in the deck, so if you're a little confused by what we mean by containerization or remote wipe, we'll talk about some of the specifics later. But we want to understand that there are specific solutions out there available to help you protect against each of the key categories of risk that we've identified here and above. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tony to talk through some of the implementation approaches and go from there.
All right, Mike, thank you very much. So, talking about implementing, the integration of mobile devices in your infrastructure, if you don't already have a plan, it's coming. And the number of organizations and what they're trying to do to integrate both the devices as well as adding some type of a mobile element to the services that they provide either to their customers or to their employees is dramatically increasing. So with that much change being introduced in the corporate environment, you have to start thinking about, all right, how do we manage these devices? Do we go with essentially corporate ownership or employee ownership? You'll hear throughout mobile discussions people using the term BYOD, which is, bring your own device. And that introduces its own complexity to the environment and has its pros and cons. And we're going to spend a few minutes just talking about each of those areas. So, for corporate ownership, what we're talking about is, your organization or the company will purchase a device, and it owns the device. It owns all the data on the device. It's responsible for supporting the device, responsible for the configuration of the device. Generally, it is not approved for personal use, and you'll find that a lot of people will have a second device in this model which is their own cell phone and their own personal phone number. The benefit to that is, certainly a greater amount of control in terms of the number and types of devices that need to be supported, versions, etc. The disadvantage there is, a lack of employee choice. Could have the employees not all that interested in using their device. There's also I'll call it a feeling among the employees that, well, it's not my device. I don't care if I lose it. It's not my device. If I drop it in a puddle, who cares? They'll just get me another one. So there's an absence of not necessarily accountability, but certainly the security and overall taking care of the device is generally lesser of a priority in the corporate-owned model. With employee ownership, employee owns the device. The company generally will allow the employee to access corporate data. They generally have to opt in, and we'll talk a little bit about what opting in means, but when we talk about the technology, but that will also generally implement a series of controls over that device should the employee opt in. So if you have your own iPhone and you want to read corporate email and have your calendar and contacts sync with your corporate email system, there's an ability to implement policy on that device before you allow that device to accept those things. The benefit there, with the employee's choice, there's greater adoption. There's generally a much greater willingness to be responsible for the device. you can have it's much more convenient for people, and they don't have to carry multiple devices. The challenge becomes, from a management and administrative perspective, you have to support a lot of different devices. So there is kind of a hybrid implementation approach that we've had several clients consider and implement, where you bring your own device, the company essentially buys it from you, puts their standard config on it, and then when you leave the organization, they essentially give it back to you with a restored generic config. And it's kind of a hybrid of both models. You get the adoption, people get their own device, the company gets some assurance on the control and security over the device. Okay? So we're going to go into some of the consideration. We talked about the approaches. We're going to get into the considerations now, and I'll have Mike start walking through some of those.
Sure, certainly. Thanks, Tony. So a number of different things that you need to consider when you're looking at trying to pick which model works best for you and how you're planning on implementing this in your environment. So first thing that we have to think about really is expense administration. Lots of different questions that we need to consider here. Who has the ability to better negotiate rates with a service provider for phone usage or data usage? Who's going to pay for the overages? So if you've got a plan and you're giving employees 500 minutes a month and they go to 1,000, who pays for that? Is it something on the employee or is it something on you? Especially given that there's going to be a combination of both business and personal calls that are taking place on the device. Again, how much effort do you really want to put into administering bring your own device reimbursement? So lots of different levers that we can play and balance here. So talking about each one of the two different solutions that we talked about before individually. With a corporate-owned plan, the company is paying the full cost of the employee's data plan. Again, based on just bargaining power of the company, they're probably going to be able to negotiate lower rates. However, you, at the same time, while you're able to potentially negotiate lower rates, you also have to pay all the overhead to have employees spend their time managing that, managing all of the devices, managing the relationships with the carriers, and dealing with abuse potentially by employees who are using the corporate plan to do personal things. In an employee-owned option, slightly different. So typically how this works is employees will be given a flat fee based upon either level or status of an amount to cover their cell phone plan and data plan each month. Again, this makes costs very predictable for the most part. It allows you to minimize the amount of administration and overhead that's put forward. You don't have employees necessarily managing all of the plans and contacting carriers and that kind of thing. However, it does lead to a number of different challenges when you have special case employees. So, for example, if you're giving an employee $50 a month and he happens to go on an international business trip and racks up a couple $100 phone bill, how do you handle that? How are you, deciding and making the decision as to whether or not the company pays for that or whether the employee does? So there's a lot of different challenges in that type of model as well. But it does give you predictable costs, which works for a lot of organizations. Second thing to consider is security. So security of the data that's on the device and what type of ownership model for data works the best. So with corporate-owned devices, key thing is security management capabilities, they can be well-defined by the organization. You own the device, you can put whatever security controls on it that you need to. Whatever software that you want on it is yours. Remote wipe capabilities are easy to enforce. There's not a lot to worry about there. From a disadvantage perspective, it's more on the functionality side. Users then can't use their device to do the things that they would like to do, and they're frustrated with their phone. They're carrying two phones, and they're probably trying their best to figure out how they can use their personal device to do some of the corporate functions, and you'll eventually get data leakage, which is a problem. On the employee-owned side, again, how do you implement and exhibit control over a device that you don't actually own and have the ability to administer? It's a challenge. You have to implement security over the data and the resources that are resident on the device, but you don't necessarily have the ability to administer it because the employee owns it. Key point here to really understand, though, is no matter what, whether the device is corporate-owned or employee-owned, the threats and the risks don't differ. They're the same. It's really all about where does your data lie and how are you implementing controls to protect it. You have to think about it in both of these models. Next thing to think about is user segmentation. So key consideration is when you're giving out mobile devices is who really needs access to data that is corporate or isn't deemed sensitive or important within the user population, and also who's heavily reliant on a data plan and who's just an occasional user. There's potential ways that you can save money or make your life easier by classifying users into categories and not having a uniform policy across the entire organization. Again, this idea that a one-size-fits-all approach to this might not be the best thing in the world. That can be extended even into corporate and employee-owned device implementation strategies. So, for example, if you have users that are dealing with sensitive corporate data, you might want to give them a corporate-owned phone on which you can implement tight security controls, whereas if you have other users who are doing things via email and they really don't have access to much that's sensitive on email, maybe you give them their own device and allow them to connect and deal with it that way. Again, you don't have to be one size fits all. It doesn't have to be a blanket approach. You can have a hybrid or a combination of both. Further, some examples of categories potentially of user segments. Best employees, think if you're running a call center, for example, someone who's working in the call center and really doesn't need to do anything on their mobile device except potentially receive email alerts about shift changes or schedule, that kind of thing. Maybe you allow them to connect from their own corporate device. Compare that to an international employee who's traveling around and who potentially has sensitive information on the phone. Maybe you want to give them a corporate-owned plan and corporate-owned device that you can manage and exhibit more control over. Again, a couple of options for recommended approach for how we would deal with this. You can see here that we've laid out company data plans probably make sense for remote users and frequent travelers or executives, but employee-owned probably works for many of the other categories listed here. So next key consideration to pay attention to is similar to user segmentation, but it's really focused on data and data segmentation. So key thing to think about, what types of data are we actually giving employees access to remotely? Is the data sensitive? Do we care about protecting it? There's a large difference between giving an employee access to email that potentially isn't sensitive on their phone and giving them access to, say, a mobile application on which they can view customer records that include social security numbers and other personally identifiable information. In scenario A, maybe we don't need to think as much about the controls that we're implementing on the device, whereas in scenario B, we have an obligation to, both from a legal perspective and a regulatory perspective, to implement controls and think about how we're going to deal with this. Again, key point here is before you can start to implement a policy and understand what controls you need to implement, you have to understand where the data is, who has access to it, and why. If you can reduce the scope of who has access to the sensitive data to the smallest user population possible, you're going to make your life a lot easier. Again, extending that thought, we look at a potential common data categorization strategy. You can have common data, important data, and sensitive data as three key categories, and sensitivities are defined as low, medium, and high. Potential solutions or recommended approaches to how you would protect that information, depending on who has access to it. You can see in a corporate-owned environment, we'd recommend, you can see from the chart where we were making recommendations in terms of whether you would use a corporate-owned or employee-owned device strategy and how you would work to implement that. So moving on to the next category. So if we're thinking about security, there's a number of different features on these modern phones and modern devices that we want to look to try to have in order to protect information and have particular controls in place. A couple key things to understand. Not every device platform is created equal. As Tony mentioned earlier, BlackBerries in the past had the capability to do email and capability to do basic communications, but didn't have the same type of app store where you have all these dynamic and unique capabilities that an Android device or an iPhone has that makes them so much flexible and so much more user-friendly. Controlling just email communications is a lot easier than having to control an open universe of applications such as on those other devices. Further, not all devices have the same types of controls that can be applied to them. So we need to understand, based on the data profile and the user profiles that we defined earlier, what controls are must-haves and what are good to have when looking at devices that we're looking to either distribute to employees or allow to connect to corporate resources. So in the following chart, we talk about some of those items. Again, a lot of technologies here to talk through. I'll highlight a couple of key things. So we mentioned remote wipe a few times earlier. Remote wipe is the idea that if you have a device that's connected to corporate resources and it becomes lost or stolen, the corporation has the ability to reach out and actually wipe the device or clear off all of the data that is on it remotely. Important thing to understand here is for that solution to work, the device actually needs to be connected to some type of network. This isn't always the case. If you have an iPad, for example, that's a Wi-Fi only iPad, that device isn't going to connect to any network unless someone has access to it and can manually configure it to connect to the Wi-Fi network and get access to the internet. In that event, there's no way for a corporate organization to wipe the device remotely. So key thing that should be involved if you're going to do a remote wipe is also have passwords that are employed on the devices and passwords that that are set up to wipe the device automatically after a certain number of attempts. That way we're ensured that if you have important or sensitive data resident on the device, it's gone in the event that it's stolen or lost. Again, numbers of different other options that we need to be thinking about here that range from device encryption to enabling or disabling the camera to even controlling the application set that can be installed on the device at all by the user. So for example, maybe you have a known list of applications that are bad and you restrict users from implementing them on devices where sensitive data is resident. So last two categories here underneath considerations. First is regulatory. Key question here is, can a bring your own device model sufficiently cover regulatory requirements? That's kind of something interesting to think about. Most of the time when we think about regulation, we think about control, standardization, and making sure that the corporation and the organization has control over all of the devices where data potentially can be stored. Obviously, we all understand some of the key regulatory and compliance items that are here, whether it's SOX or HIPAA or Gramm-Leach-Bliley, PCI, or Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. In each one of these situations, the key thing to understand, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but we have to understand where the sensitive data that's being addressed by each one of these regulations exists. If it exists on the phone itself, we need to make sure that we have controls in place on the phone, just like we would any corporate device that has access to that data. If the information doesn't reside in the phone, we don't necessarily have to have controls on the phone protecting it because it doesn't exist there. So it's, again, understanding your data profiles, where it exists, and then implementing controls as possible. If you can do that, then the answer is yes. Bring your own device policies can absolutely work and still satisfy each one of these regulatory requirements. Again, a couple of other key considerations to think about. E-discovery, we have to understand that if there's email or other data that's corporate owned or corporate related that's sitting on an employee-owned device, that's all discoverable in the event that you have litigation or pending action. And you have to figure out how, from a policy perspective, you're going to get your employees to comply with that. Data retention and archiving becomes a key thing here as well. Typically, mobile devices are not content creation devices. They're more content consumption devices. So data typically resides someplace else as a primary source, and you're usually just viewing it from the phone. But that is changing. As iPads are becoming more slick, you got employees that are using iPads as a primary machine where they've connected a keyboard to it and a mouse. Content creation becomes a big thing. If you're storing new documents that you're creating on your phone, you're probably going to want to figure out a way to back that up, and it's really important for the organization to pay attention to that. Last kind of key point here is around international implications of this and privacy laws. So in the United States, if you have corporate-owned email, the corporate email is the property and it is owned by the corporation and the organization. So privacy laws that apply, since the data is owned by the corporation, they have access to it and can do things with it. If you're looking at Europe or some of the other countries around the world where privacy laws are very different, data in a corporate email system that is produced by an individual user is actually owned by that individual user themselves. Because of that, that complicates greatly the things that you can do in order to protect the email, search it, look for sensitive data, and potentially implement controls over their communications. So it complicates things and makes things a little bit more of a challenge. Lastly, I want to talk a bit about policy. So one of the key things to implementing any type of mobile device solution or strategy is having a good policy in place where you're informing your users of potential pitfalls or hazards and making sure that the organization has the ability to do the things that it needs to do to control and protect information and the devices themselves. So what sort of mobile policies do they look like? We have to talk about, obviously, expense management, how we're going to deal with expectations of the users, what they're going to be doing from a usage perspective, from a security perspective, and inform users of how the organization is going to potentially access the device, control it, and protect it. You need to make sure that this policy applies across the entire enterprise. We don't want to have select pockets of users that are like, yeah, whatever, we'll let them connect with their phone and do things that are outside of the purview of the policy. The policy clearly needs to be mobile technology agnostic, meaning it has to address phones, laptops, and tablets generally. It shouldn't simply address a particular model or type of phone because the market is changing rapidly. There's new phones released almost every other month. And you want to make sure that this is general enough to cover all of them in all situations so you're not constantly updating it. Most importantly, we need to think about different ways in which we can segment user and data, implement user segmentation and data segmentation so employees know what to expect based on their role in the company and based on the type of data that they have access to on the phone. Further, data categories needs to be extended so that corporate-owned assets are well-defined and employee-owned assets are well-defined. For example, if you have email on the device, and that is clearly a corporate resource, or if you have access to financial information that you're looking at on the device, that's clearly corporate-owned information. But if the employee is taking pictures with the phones and creating content of his own that's pictures of his kids or pictures of things that are personal, we have to make sure that we understand how we're dealing with that type of data differently from how we're dealing with corporate-owned information. Lastly, we definitely need to make sure that employees are affirming this in writing, as with any policy, to make sure that we're sure that they understand what their expectations are and how the policy itself will be implemented. So moving on and getting into some details. Acceptable use. Obviously, usage protocols are important. We need to inform employees and train them about how they need to, what they need to do from a device perspective in terms of sharing, protecting information on a device, what types of networks they can connect to, and the types of applications that they should be installing. Typical situation that you might have, maybe we've got an executive in the company who has an iPad which is connected to corporate resources, has a connection to the financial system, has corporate email, and on the weekends, his kids use the iPad and they take it to Starbucks and connect to the network there. So that obviously introduces a lot of risks, and we have to make sure that we understand what's acceptable use once the user has connected that device to the network and what is not. Second, have to have information in there about user responsibility. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of times if you're giving away corporate devices to employees, they have this idea that, oh, well, I'm not paying attention to it, it's not mine. If I lose it or steal it, someone steals it, we'll just get another one. We have to make sure that they understand that there are responsibilities from the user perspective in terms of protecting that device. Further, having standards in place in terms of how you're going to protect the device, eligible devices, potential devices that we don't want on the network, device and operating system version requirements, all of these things are really important. Further, we have to lay out all the controls that we would potentially be putting on the device so users understand what to expect. Further, loss notification needs to be a key thing there. We have to make sure that users are notifying IT if they ever have a lost or stolen device so that we can actually do and implement the remote wipe capabilities that we have enabled. Lastly, we need to talk through enforcement. Again, making sure that key controls are implemented on the device. We have to describe what they are, how they're implemented, and what users can expect. More considerations, talking about network access. So we need to understand from a network access perspective what networks and what data the user is going to be able to access and what specific controls or key controls might be applied to the device based on what it is that they're doing. We have to understand and introduce concepts to the user about liability and privacy, who owns the information, where it exists, etc. How reimbursement policies work.
Mike, a couple of comments just to clarify for folks. When we talk about in the earlier policy considerations, it was access of the device. That was external network access. What networks is it possible or is it allowed to use the network on an unsecured public network, such as in a Starbucks or in a McDonald's? Network access here is talking about actual internal network resources. What is it allowed to use and what is it allowed to touch? And then when we're talking about the liability and the privacy issue here, you need to have a positive affirmation from your people that when I hit remote wipe, everything on that device is gone, not just the corporate stuff. So their contacts, pictures of their trip to Hawaii, everything is going to get blown away. They need to understand that going into it, that is part of the process. Now, we're going to talk about technology a little later, and in particular, we're going to allude to containerization and the ability to potentially take the corporate information and segregate it from the rest of the information so you have some granular ability to control what information is being deleted. But, the out-of-the-box configuration for, the wipe after X failed password attempts will delete everything on the machine, corporate and personal, okay?
That's correct. Thanks, Tony. All right, so moving on, I want to hit the last three categories here. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about reimbursement and how that works. We need to clearly define that to employees so that they understand what to expect. If you're putting a cap on the amount that you're going to be reimbursing employees every month, that needs to be clearly defined. If the company is just going to pay for the plan, we have to make sure that users understand what it is that they can do and what they can't do. If we don't have an unlimited text messaging plan, for example, you wouldn't want an employee sending 1,000 text messages in a month to his kids. Obviously, that's going to rack up a high number of charges. It's personal use, and we have to understand that. Finally, procurement strategies are related directly to this. So how are we getting phones to employees that are looking to participate in the corporate-owned plan? And lastly, support capabilities. How are you going to be supporting the device in either the employee-owned or corporate-owned model? So key things to understand here are both what the user should expect. So if you have an employee-owned device, can he call the help desk and get advice on how to fix it if he's having a problem, or should he be calling the carrier or the phone provider? And also support from a control perspective. Does the user expect that corporate employees have administrative access to his device that can do things and administer and implement controls? You have to define both categories in your policy. So as Tony alluded to earlier, we want to talk a bit about some of the solutions that are out there and available that will allow you to both implement mobile devices in a secure and controlled way, but also enable this within your environment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so getting into kind of the technology, when we're talking about how do you access corporate resources, and then how do we enforce mobile policy? So we're going to address kind of the corporate resource issue first, and then we're going to talk about the enforcement of mobile policy and the capabilities of some of the tools to allow you to enforce mobile policy. So for some of the techie people, it's going to sound like we've brought back kind of the old days of mainframe or terminal sessions when we're talking about some of these things, but here are the two basic models for providing access to corporate resources. You've got what are called fat clients and thin clients. So the way a fat client works is essentially the application itself and all of the data associated with the application is pushed down to the device. And then that device can operate somewhat independently with the application and the data. The thin client, you essentially only push an interface that then connects via a network back to corporate resources to allow the access to the information and access to the application. Okay? So kind of the pros and cons, you know, with the fat client, generally data is available faster. You have no communication concerns. You could have no Wi-Fi signal, no 3G, 4G signal, and still have the complete functionality of the app. The disadvantage there is, you know, there's an increased risk of data loss in the event of a physical loss. All the data is sitting on the device. And the application support effort can be significant. So, for example, the application you have to develop for an Apple iOS device is different, honestly, than an Android device. And the architectures for the data storage can be different, how they interact, and you have to develop for both of those. Where with the thin client, it's just developing an interface that goes to a common or shared set of data and resources. Generally, it's an enhanced web interface that that is a front end to an enterprise application or an application. And so the benefits of the thin client, none of the data is actually on the device. So the physical loss versus data loss issue is much less prevalent on the thin client, and your security management becomes easier because you have only really to manage the security from a centralized perspective. The challenge there becomes one, you know, you're essentially at the whim of the performance of the network you're connected to, so you could have, you know, latency or performance issues with that. There's generally a second level of authentication required, which, you know, from a risk management perspective, I'm not sure is all bad. And then, you know, aside from latency, there could be service disruptions. You're not always going to be in a place where you have network access. So that's kind of the content delivery message. Now let's talk a little bit about the technology around what is broadly called mobile device management and some of the capabilities. And you'll find that we've alluded to these capabilities throughout much of the presentation today, but I wanted to make sure we spend a little bit of time just so you had a clear understanding of what's available. The other comment I'll make to kind of preface this discussion is that these tools are now available across platforms. You know, if I had to give you know, a grading on the maturity of the tools for BlackBerry is the highest. At this point, from an enterprise mobile device management perspective, Apple is in second place, just a little bit behind, and then kind of in third place behind that would be kind of the Android set. But I'll tell you that while they are, in terms of maturity, some separation, these basic capabilities are available for all the platforms. Okay, so when we're talking about mobile device management, let's talk a little more detail. When we have enforcement, so the ability to enforce policies on devices, the ability to say to stop a user from accessing resources until they acknowledge we can't give you access until we implement a new policy. Is that, say okay or cancel. If you cancel, you don't get access to the resources. If you say okay, policy is pushed to the device. And then the tools actually have the ability to report and detect exactly what versions of the operating systems are installed, what data has been installed. There is the next topic when we're talking about jailbroken iOS devices. Those are iOS devices that have essentially been modified to allow the installation of applications that are not installed through the Apple App Store. That's really what it's all about. And that can be a challenge because the one advantage that Apple has is they have a great amount of control over exactly what applications get installed, what the impact, there's a lot of testing that goes into the application, and they have some predictability around what the performance impact and stability impact of the application is before it gets installed. A jailbroken phone has very little of those controls and generally is something that you would not want to have access to your corporate infrastructure. The other capability, again, from an enforcement perspective, you have the ability to enforce restrictions, either from non-compliant devices, application downloads, and you can do it really in two ways. You can have a list of kind of blacklisted applications. These are the applications that are not allowed to be installed, or it's sometimes easier to say, you know what, that list is too big. Let's just build the list of here's the list of applications that are allowed to be installed, and then if somebody wants something else, they make a case for it, and then it gets added to the white list, and that tends to make the administrative burden a little less on your IT and management team. Web access monitoring keeps track of where people are going, what they're doing, roaming usage. So that's where your telecom providers will tend to get you, is that if you are roaming quite a bit, that's when you can get into kind of overage charges. It can also enforce the separation. So this is where we're getting into the containerization, the ability to have a isolated part of your system or a folder where corporate resources, corporate applications, corporate data resides, and then when you go to click on that or to open that, you get prompted for a second password, and from that perspective, then you get access to those resources. That has become probably the fastest growing area from a corporate management perspective. So then talking about security, well, before we get to that, the detection of any violation in policy and auto alerts to IT. So the devices are regularly polled. If for whatever reason there's something, it had the apps installed and then somebody jailbroke it, it'll actually monitor that and alert that so that IT folks will know, hey, listen, this person was in compliance with the policy and now they're not. They installed the apps, they opted in, and then they jailbroke it, and we need to find that person and restore the original config on the device. Okay, so going into security, password enforcement, complexity, regular changing of passwords, locking of the devices, the remote wipe and both selective versus total, encrypting data. So that's a big capability. When quick anecdote, knowing we've got a couple of minutes, was at a security conference a little while ago, and somebody had set up a recharging kiosk in the middle of the conference, and people were like, oh, that's great, my cell phone's dying, and everybody plugged in their cell phones and not realizing that everybody that plugged in their cell phone was having the data pulled off of that device. And as the final keynote presentation of the day, the group that was responsible said, hey, listen, what are you people doing? we now have all of the data for every device that was plugged into our recharging station. Data encryption is the way you would protect that. So, having the data encrypted so that, a third party couldn't read it or doesn't have access to the encryption key and couldn't read it is the way you would manage that particular risk. Certificate-based authentication, that's a second layer of authentication or a second factor of authentication. You see that all the time with like SSL encryption and other things. The ability to archive, monitoring devices, rogue applications, firewalling. And what I mean by firewalling is essentially separating when you're connecting to, if you're connecting from a public network into corporate resources, that there's actually a way to restrict access from the public network into those corporate resources. And then, anti-malware protection. Okay. So let's talk about some of these some of the other things. And I know we've only got 3 or 4 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get these last topics in. Containerization. We've talked about that several times. One of the fastest growing areas from the mobile device management perspective, and one of the key ways in which you can allow personal use or BYOD situations and still have some control over corporate data and still allow the employee to do the things that they want to do with their personal device. And you can set it so that the container is encrypted. You can remotely wipe the container. It'll actually manage and monitor the container to ensure that any of the data within the container is not accessed by any other applications or even the OS in some cases, so that you can't take data out. You can't cut and paste from one app to another app, etc. Application management, we talked about unapproved or approved applications, whitelisting and blacklisting. You can patch the OSs. You can actually do backup and restoration. And you can actually, for the fat client environments, you can actually do pushes of data refreshes through these tools. File sharing, the ability to potentially, Mike had alluded to the fact that these devices were primarily, content consumption devices, but they are becoming more content creation devices. What happens? How do you, somebody emails you a document, and now there's editors where you can go in and you can mark up a document and send it back. How do you share that document? How do you keep that document secure while you have it in your possession and you need to send it somewhere? That is all capabilities that an MDM solution would afford. And lastly, but I would say almost as important, is kind of the ability to scale. Manual administration of individual devices for a couple of dozen is not a big deal. You start to have a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand, it becomes a very big deal. And maintaining the same rigor of control across all the devices is made a lot easier using one of these MDM tools. Okay. So our last topic we'll spend just a minute on, because we're just about out of time, and it is our last slide, is to just kind of walk through a high-level deployment roadmap. And with that, I'll turn that over to Mike just to spend a minute on.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Tony. So, kind of key things if you're looking to try to do this and you're looking to try to implement a mobile device strategy. You need to approach this just like you would any large project that you're looking to implement across the organization. You're looking at implementing mobile devices as a new platform, and you need to figure out how you're going to control this and deal with it in a proper way. First step, obviously you need to establish a steering committee for the project, people who can make decisions so that you have some senior executive sponsorship who can make decisions about who can have devices, who can't, what data can be on devices, what can't. In other words, without that type of sponsorship, you're going to struggle as an IT department to actually implement whatever it is that you decide to implement. Next key thing, you need to assess what currently exists within the environment today. I'm positive that you all have mobile devices that are connected to your networks. You need to take a look at that, understand what it is, and figure out where your key risks are and what the key features are that employees are taking advantage of. Need to define the scope of the project. What are you looking at? What are you not looking at? establish resources that you're going to need to get this done, whether that be people, process, or technology. You need all of those components defined. Looking at procuring supporting technology, whether that's phones themselves or MDM solutions, or potentially other ways in which you're going to manage the phones and the applications that reside on them. Have to define, based on all those characteristics that you just came up with, policies, and that's probably going to take a number of different revisions. You've got to introduce that to users. You have to get them to buy off on it, sign off on it, and go forward. And then finally, once you have all of those key components in place, you can then look to deploy your mobile device strategy and solution in a secure and efficient manner organization-wide.
Okay, folks, so this is Tony. I'll wrap it up. That was our last slide, and I apologize based on our time. We had to go through that pretty quickly. I know we're essentially out of time. I'll ask Rihanna, do we want to do some QA now, or would we prefer to, we'll wrap it up and we'll send a follow-up with answers to any of the submitted questions?
Yeah, I think since we are at the top of the hour, I want to be conscious of everybody's calendars and their time. So unfortunately, I'd say we really don't have time for Q&A on the webinar today, but certainly these gentlemen are gracious enough that they're happy to follow up with your questions offline, and we will do that and make sure that your questions get answered. So with that, I want to say a special thanks to Tony, Mike, and the Grant Thornton team for bringing us this great content today. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope all of you did as well. We will be circulating again this recorded webinar along with the slide deck, so you will have all the information, and feel free to drop myself a note if you have any questions, and I can certainly connect you with the Grant Thornton team. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.